There are some very good VR games out there, and there are some not so great ones. But every time I plug into VR and enter another world, I just can't help but wonder what else is possible. The truth is that the majority of VR games out there don't fully take advantage of everything the hardware has to offer. Valve's recent Half-Life Alyx really got me thinking about this. Despite being a truly fantastic game with the best VR graphics and storytelling in the market, the gameplay didn't really innovate the same way Valve's old titles did. Other than the gravity gloves, there didn't really seem to be a huge reason this game needed to be in VR. Granted, those gloves are a pretty damn good reason. But with relatively new headsets like Valve's own Index providing stunning audio, increased field of view, and near-perfect controllers, it's about time the software caught up with the hardware. So I put together a list of 4 games that I believe best represent the future of virtual reality. For better or worse, these games push the boundaries of what we thought was possible in gaming. Welcome to the VR frontier. Boneworks was a risky game to make. A lot of VR devs make sacrifices in the name of player comfort, but Stress Level Zero decided to build the game that no one else would. Advertised as experimental and advanced, Boneworks uses its excellent physics engine in just about every aspect of gameplay. Right from the get-go, it proves it isn't bluffing by starting the story out with one of the most notoriously difficult actions in VR: throwing objects. This is not a game for beginners, and if you don't have your VR sea legs, things will get even rougher, as the game has a deep focus on traversal. Climbing up and across walls, falling from dizzying heights, and launching through the air are par for the course. And not only is your entire body physics enabled, but so is almost every object you come across. Boneworks has a practically unmatched level of environmental interaction. The first instance of combat in the game puts you in an alleyway with no weapons. So, what's around you? Literally any object in the world can be used as a weapon. Admittedly, there are many fights throughout the game where you don't have much of a choice but to use guns, especially when fighting omni-projectors. But most of the time when encountering the melee-focused nobodies and zombies, you're pretty much open to creativity. And of course, puzzles rely on physics just the same, allowing you to throw barrels into a gravity well, ride on giant wheels, or move entire platforms to access the next area. But a lot of other games do have things like this. After all, there's not really that much that's impressive about pushing a lever or flipping a switch. What Boneworks has that no other VR game I've played has come even close to matching is a realistic feeling body. The main reason this game is so immersive is because when I reach out, my hands and arms really feel like my hands and arms. Body movement is just so natural, nothing really lags behind, unless you're lifting very heavy objects, which has to slow you down a little bit to simulate weight. However, when handling small objects and firearms, everything just feels so snappy. But of course, this is no easy task to develop. That's why most VR games typically go for the floating hands approach. But there really is something to be said about having a full body, legs and all. So to simplify things, what Boneworks has in other games is physics. Everything from the environment, to enemies, to guns, and of course your own body uses it. That's the first piece of our puzzle. But despite being what is probably my personal favorite VR experience, there are still a lot of things missing from Boneworks, namely, guns. The weapon selection is pretty limited, and even though they feel fantastic to manipulate, there's an element of realism that isn't there. After all, there's not even a dedicated eject magazine button, at least not on my controllers. So I figured it might be a good idea to take a look at a game that puts guns above all else. No game has ever entertained me so much by allowing me to do basically nothing. I spend almost all of my time with hot dogs, horseshoes, and hand grenades, sitting in Hickok 45's range, just shooting guns at targets. I can do this for hours on end. And the reason for that is H3 VR has the most realistic firearms of any VR game. To put it bluntly, the guns feel real. Nothing is left up to automation. The player has complete control over their weapons, and every little action can be executed with precision. Swapping mags, racking bolts, lining up and dropping targets, it's all you. Doing all of this with a mouse and keyboard just can't compare. It's a totally different experience. However, nothing comes without its drawbacks. Since there really are no handicaps when it comes to weapon handling, all those actions I described a moment ago can get a little bit tedious. Magazines have to be lined up with the mag well perfectly, or you'll get this happening. You kinda need perfect precision to get it right, meaning that actions that are tied to a single button press on keyboard and mouse, or incredibly simplified in other VR games, instead require practice, and in some instances maybe even a little bit of real-life firearms knowledge, or a subscription to forgotten weapons. But I think that the challenging nature of basic actions is 100% worth it, since the attention to detail is incredible. I mean, I've never seen a game where you can close the dust cover on an AR. And also having complete freedom with rails is a plus, even though maybe there should be a couple limits. And while there are game modes that let you take on waves of armed hot dogs in a hilarious manner, I still just keep finding myself coming back to a peaceful shooting range and chilling out, blinking targets with a 22. Or a minigun. But the main reason that I picked H3 VR for this list is realism. Obviously not all games have to be realistic, but the rules change a little bit in VR. The goal of virtual reality should be to convince the player that they are in the world. And for that to happen, objects you hold in your hands need to feel real. And that doesn't just apply to guns. Radios should have functional buttons, writing utensils should let me make inappropriate drawings, and food should be edible. The point I'm getting at is that elements of the world around you should be functional. And that brings us to our next game. There's no denying that VR feels like it was made for flight and space sims. Some of the best virtual reality experiences I have ever had have been in Elite Dangerous, or even the recent Star Wars Squadrons. But there's always an element missing. There's all these buttons just itching to be pressed, but you're typically locked to a gamepad, joystick, or keyboard. And that's where Vtol VR comes in. With Vtol, your hands are finally free, and an entire functional cockpit is at your disposal. Bet you might want to buckle up, because this one can get a little bit dizzy. What makes Vtol VR my new favorite flight sim is all these beautiful buttons, all of which you have to use your actual hands to interact with. Vtol doesn't even support gamepads or HOTAS setups. It is fully committed to immersion by forcing the player to use VR controllers, which if you're on an index is even better. Even the startup procedure for a jet is awesome. Sure, it's complicated and takes time to learn, but if you're willing to put in the effort, this game is incredibly rewarding. Of course, don't get the impression that I'm particularly good at it. Most of my combat missions end with my destruction. And there's still some things I don't entirely understand how to work, like locking on with different types of missiles. But there's a lot of depth here, maybe more than the average player would like. But then again, it is still a flight sim, and that's usually how these games go. And perhaps the most impressive part of Vtol VR is how smooth the plane handling is. You'd think reaching out and grabbing a floating joystick that doesn't exist would be uncomfortable, but it works surprisingly well. And I always feel perfectly in control of my aircraft. The flight model isn't the most realistic and is very forgiving to mistakes, but it never ceases to be enjoyable. But of course, as you might have guessed, there is a trade-off. Vtol VR is one of the most sickening VR games I've ever played. My first 4 hours had me taking breaks every 10 minutes or so to remind my body it was still on solid ground. Obviously, it's possible to get over the dizziness, but with this game it takes much longer than most games. There aren't many options for player comfort, and being a small budget game with a single dev, there are instances of jank that don't help either, such as when ejecting. I'd recommend closing your eyes while pulling this lever if you want to avoid throwing up. But these things are the cost of advancement. There's nothing like reaching out, grabbing a joystick, and being in control of a plane for real. And as far as gameplay goes, you can take off and land from aircraft carriers, refuel midair, inevitably crashing because this is really hard to do, and even using an underbelly camera to lock onto ground targets with laser-guided missiles and bombs. And even though it's not exactly related to the topic at hand, I feel like I have to mention this game's virtual body. You can't walk around or anything since you're always confined to a seat, but it uses a pretty genius method to avoid that weird stretchy arm effect you see in some games. Vtol has sleeves above the arms that are separated from the actual arms themselves, so when you reach beyond the max length of the sleeves, the shirt stays in place while your arms continue outward. This is such a stupidly simple solution to a problem so many VR games have that I can't believe this is the first game I've seen it in. I could talk all about the minuscule features throughout this game, but in the end, there's only one reason I really put Vtol VR on the list, and it is this: true interactivity. This is what I want the future of VR to be. Everything here just works. I mean, I guess it might be a little overkill to have every single button, switch, knob, and lever fully functional in every VR game. That would make a game like Half-Life Alyx a little overwhelming. But for the type of games it makes sense in, like flight sims, having all of this to play with is incredible. Some games, however, don't need millions of buttons. Sometimes, all they need is a little bit of simplicity. The genius of Beat Saber is just how damn simple it is. Sure, I love complex and advanced VR experiences meant to simulate real life in every way possible, but what makes Beat Saber so fantastic is that literally anyone can pick it up and play. And this kind of game is incredibly important for VR to be pushed into the mainstream. To really understand this, let's rewind time back to 2006, when the original Wii was released. With this console, so many people who previously had no experience with video games could pick up a remote and have no problem getting into it. It was basically just an extension of your own hands. But ever since the Wii, the video game industry has moved away from this ultra user-friendly approach. But that may have changed with Beat Saber. Other VR games have tried something similar in the past, but Beat Saber nails it. This is absolutely the best game to introduce someone to VR with. Just wave around sabers in the air and hit blocks to the music. It's that simple. And not only that, but what also put Beat Saber on this list is that it's the only game I've played where the mechanics cannot be replicated in 2D in any way. Boneworks' physics gameplay was inspired by the old Half-Life games. Receiver has arguably the same amount of depth as H3 VR, and Microsoft Flight Sim lets you press even more buttons on the dash than Vtol. Obviously, all these experiences work better in VR, but the point is that it's possible to somewhat translate the features of most VR games to two dimensions, but not with Beat Saber. It totally reinvented the rhythm game genre by creating a whole new style of gameplay. If there is a traditional game like it that I haven't found yet, please let me know, but right now it feels pretty damn unique. So the final piece of the puzzle to the future of VR? Well, because if it's not fun, why bother? As one of the most accessible VR games available, Beat Saber shows that sometimes a game just needs to be fun. As the barrier to entry gets lower over time with decreasing prices and lower requirements, and even standalone kits like the Oculus Quest, it's important that anyone will be able to pick up a headset and enjoy themselves without having to put in any extra work. So when I introduce someone to VR, I give them the choice between Beat Saber and Space Pirate Trainer. Well, they usually pick the one with guns, but Beat Saber is always an option. Now, of course, all the things that are normally important in game development are important here too. Graphics, story, level design, AI, and all that. But the real innovation for VR has to come from gameplay first. And all the games I just showed you are the ones that I feel best represent what the future of VR will look like. They might sacrifice things like player comfort or even general stability, but in one or more ways, they are all on the VR frontier. So thank you for watching. Consider subscribing if you enjoyed this video, and if you're interested, I just launched a Patreon campaign. If you want to support the channel and help me increase the quality and frequency of my uploads, then click the link below to check out my page. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.